there is a piece of jewelry around your neck, or hanging on the wall of someone you know, or carved above the entrance of a building in your city that was originally designed to make death as slow, as painful, and as publicly humiliating as possible. Think about that for a moment, not abstractly. Specifically, the shape that appears on church spires and gold chains, and tattoo parlor walls, and the covers of albums, and the tops of Christmas trees, and the flag of Switzerland and dozens of other national flags was engineered by people who wanted to communicate to an entire watching population that the person attached to it had reached the absolute end of what any person could be, that there was no lower place, that this was the bottom. And then something happened to that shape. The people who invented it were meticulous about what it could do to a human body. They understood the mechanics of suffocation, the progressive failure of the muscles involved in breathing as the arms bear weight, the way the body's own efforts to survive prolonged the dying. They understood how long it was possible to keep someone alive in that position. They understood the psychological effect on witnesses of being forced to observe someone dying that slowly, in that posture, in that public space, with no possibility of intervention. It was not a symbol. It was a machine, a very precisely engineered machine for producing a very specific outcome. And then something happened that has no real parallel in the history of human culture. The people who gathered around the man who died on that machine looked at it afterward, and instead of wanting to forget it existed, they decided to remember it, to represent it, eventually, to travel thousands of miles to find what they believed were pieces of it, to build their most sacred spaces in its shape. How does the most degrading instrument of state execution in the ancient world become the most recognized symbol of hope in the history of Western civilization? That is the question this video is going to answer. And the answer is stranger and more historically specific and more theologically radical than most people who wear the symbol have ever been told. Start with what crucifixion actually was. Most people have a visual image of crucifixion that comes from art, from film, from the particular tradition of representation that developed in Christian culture over 17 centuries. That image has been refined in specific directions that tend to minimize what the Roman practice actually involved. The historical reality is worth knowing, not for the sake of graphic detail, but because the full weight of what was later done with this symbol is impossible to understand without it. Crucifixion was not invented by the Romans. They inherited it from earlier empires, but they systematized it, refined it, and deployed it with a specific intention that went beyond simply ending a life. The Romans had many ways to execute people. Crucifixion was reserved for a specific category: slaves, violent criminals, rebels against Roman authority, and people of low social status who needed to be made examples of in the most public and prolonged way possible. A Roman citizen could not be crucified. This was a legal protection. The method was considered too degrading to apply to someone of standing. When Cicero, the Roman orator, wanted to describe something as the absolute worst, the most shameful, the most beyond the pale imaginable, he used crucifixion as his reference point. He called it the most cruel and most frightening of punishments. The design was deliberate. The person was not simply killed. They were displayed, positioned in a way that was physically distressing and publicly visible for as long as the body could sustain it. The elevation was part of the point. Everyone could see. The nakedness was part of the point. Nothing was hidden. The slowness was part of the point. There was time for everyone to observe and to understand what happened to people who challenged Roman order, and the location was part of the point. Crucifixions happened at roads, at city gates, in the most trafficked public spaces, not because those were convenient places to die, but because the maximum number of people needed to witness it. The bodies were often left afterward for days. The message was architectural. This is what this empire does, and this is what it does to the kind of person who ends up here. This is the object that eventually became the most widespread symbol in Western history, but not immediately, not for several centuries. And the gap between the execution and the symbol is the part of this history that almost never gets told. For the first 250 years of Christian history, the cross was not the primary symbol of the faith. This is documented, visible, and provable by looking at the archaeological and artistic record. The earliest Christian art found in the catacombs of Rome in burial sites, in the private objects carried by early believers, shows a consistent set of symbols that does not prominently feature the cross. The fish, in Greek ichthys, an acronym that formed a phrase meaning Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, was everywhere. The Good Shepherd, a figure carrying a sheep on his shoulders, appeared frequently on walls and signs. The Chi Rho, the overlapping first two letters of Christ's title in Greek, appeared as a kind of monogram. The anchor, evoking both safety and the shape of a cross, without depicting the execution device directly. The dove, the lamb, these were the visual vocabulary of the early Christian community. Why not the cross? Because they knew what it was. These were people who lived in the Roman world. Many of them had seen crucifixions. Some of them lived near roads where crucified bodies were displayed for days at a time. They knew what the object meant in their cultural context, with an immediacy and a specificity that no modern person can fully reconstruct. It meant the worst end a person could have. It meant the erasure of social standing, of dignity, of any claim to be taken seriously. The idea of venerating that object, of wearing it as an ornament or carving it above a doorway, would have required the same kind of imaginative leap that the idea of wearing a miniature electric chair as jewelry requires today. The association was too raw, too recent, and too specific in its social meaning to be easily repurposed. Paul understood this and named it directly. Writing to the community in Corinth, he acknowledged that the message of the cross was a stumbling block to Jewish audiences and foolishness to Gentile ones. The Greek word he used for stumbling block was scandalon, the root of the English word scandal. Not a polite disagreement, an offense. The idea that the one claimed to be the Son of God had died in the manner specifically reserved for slaves and criminals struck the educated, cosmopolitan Greek and Roman world as simply incoherent. Gods did not die like that. Divine figures did not end up on the lowest rung of Roman justice. The claim was not just theologically controversial. It was socially embarrassing. The early Christian thinkers did not try to minimize this. They made the scandal the point. Paul's most extended treatment of this is almost aggressive in its embrace of the contradiction. He says that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God stronger than human strength. He says that God chose what the world considers foolish to shame the wise. The cross was not presented as less terrible than it was. It was presented as terrible in precisely the way that matters, and as pointing towards something that the categories of terrible and triumphant were inadequate to contain. This is an extraordinary intellectual move, and it remained primarily theological, primarily verbal, for a long time. The cross was talked about before it was depicted. The transformation of the cross from avoided association to central symbol as a specific historical pivot point, one of the most consequential moments in the history of Western civilization. The conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. The story as it came to be told, and as it influenced subsequent history, regardless of its precise historical accuracy, is this. In the year 312, on the eve of a decisive military battle at the Milvian Bridge near Rome that would determine who ruled the Western Roman Empire, Constantine either saw a vision or experienced a dream, depending on which of the contemporary accounts you consult. The accounts differ in detail. What they agree on is that he encountered a symbol in the sky or in sleep, accompanied by words that in Latin became in hoc signo vinces. By this sign, conquer. The symbol was a form of the Chi Rho. He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with it. He won the battle decisively. The two contemporary accounts of this vision differ significantly in their details, and historians have debated for centuries how literally to read either of them. What role genuine religious experience played versus political calculation, and what Constantine actually believed versus what he found useful to claim. These are fascinating questions without definitive answers. What is historically beyond dispute is what came next. Constantine ended the systematic persecution of Christians, issued edicts extending legal toleration to the Christian faith, began using imperial resources to build churches, and within his lifetime saw the Roman state and the Christian movement move from active hostility to active alignment. The faith that had been illegal to practice publicly became the religion of the most powerful man in the world. And crucially, within the arc of his reign, crucifixion as a method of execution was abolished in the Roman Empire. The stated reason, in the tradition that developed around this decision, was reverence for the cross as a sacred object. Whatever the precise reasoning, the practical effect was significant. The cross was removed from immediate lived reality as a current instrument of death. People stopped seeing people crucified on the roads. The object began to move from present horror to historical reference. And a symbol can bear a weight of meaning that an active instrument of ongoing killing cannot easily carry in the same way. When you no longer regularly encounter the object in its original function, it becomes available for a different kind of meaning. The next chapter of the transformation is associated with Constantine's mother, Helena, around the year 326. Already in her late 70s, she traveled to Jerusalem on what is described as a pilgrimage, combining personal religious devotion with imperial patronage of sacred sites. She oversaw the construction of basilicas at locations associated with the birth and death of Jesus, and is credited with identifying and commemorating several of the sites that became the central pilgrimage destinations of the Christian world. The tradition that developed around her visit, and that became enormously influential in subsequent centuries, is that she identified and recovered the physical remains of the cross on which Jesus had been crucified. The account was elaborated over subsequent generations, with different versions specifying different details of how the discovery was made and how the authenticity of the cross was established. The historicity of the discovery itself has been a matter of historical debate for almost as long as the story has existed, and scholarly opinion on it varies considerably. What is historically beyond dispute is what the story produced. Fragments of what was claimed to be the true cross began to circulate across the Christian world within decades. Reliquaries of great elaborateness and value were constructed to contain them. Churches were built specifically to house them. Pilgrims made journeys of extraordinary difficulty and expense to venerate what they believed was the physical material of the object itself. The philosopher Erasmus, writing more than 1,000 years after these events, observed with his characteristic wit that the accumulated fragments of the true cross distributed across European churches would together have been sufficient to build a ship. This was almost certainly an exaggeration, though the actual total of claimed fragments is not small. But the observation captured something real about the proliferation. People wanted the object, not just its representation. The object, or as close to the object as they could get. The cross had completed a transformation that would have been unthinkable to the people who watched it used as an instrument of state violence, from avoided association to theological category to desired physical artifact, from the thing nobody wanted to acknowledge to the thing everybody wanted to touch. This transformation had theological content that deserves to be stated clearly. The doctrine that developed was not simply that the cross was a useful visual shorthand for the Christian movement. It was that the cross represented the supreme demonstration of a divine logic that operates by inversion. The instrument that Rome used to show that certain people were finished, that certain challenges to power had been definitively answered, had become, in Christian interpretation, the demonstration that such answers were not final. That what looks like total defeat can be the beginning of something the power doing the defeating is not capable of comprehending. This is a radical claim about the nature of power itself. It says that the measure of ultimate significance is not the capacity to destroy, but something that persists even through destruction. It says that the last word is not spoken by whoever has the most force available, that the most certain-looking endings are not always the actual endings. That claim, whatever one thinks of its specific Christian theological content, represents a genuinely subversive challenge to every system of power that has ever operated by using the threat of ultimate harm to maintain control. But the history of the symbol does not stop at the theology, because the symbol was then picked up and carried forward by the institution that grew around the theology, and the institution found uses for the symbol that the original theology would not have recognized. The Crusades are the most dramatic and the most historically documented example. Beginning with the First Crusade in 1095, armies of soldiers marched across Europe and into the Middle East, wearing crosses sewn onto their clothing, sometimes literally cut from red cloth and attached to the chest or shoulder. They carried banners bearing the cross. They received papal assurances that dying on the crusade was spiritually equivalent to martyrdom. The cross was explicitly understood as sacred authorization for military conquest, as divine guarantee of the righteousness of what they were doing. The man who died on the cross, who offered no physical resistance to the soldiers who arrested him, who according to the gospel accounts told his followers to put away their swords, whose last recorded words included a prayer for those who had put him there, became the symbolic patron of armies, using significant military force to kill people who stood in the way of controlling territory. This is one of the most significant symbolic reversals in the history of any religion. The cross that pointed toward the victim of state violence was turned into the emblem of state violence. The cross that pointed toward the one who refused the way of force was used to bless and authorize force on a massive scale. The symbol of the lowest point of human humiliation, the death of a criminal, was elevated as the banner of people with the most powerful armies of their era. There were Christian voices at the time who pointed out aspects of this contradiction. Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached the Second Crusade with great fervor, also wrote with remarkable theological care about the nature of Christian violence and its spiritual costs. But the symbol had accumulated enough institutional and emotional weight that its specific historical meaning could be subordinated to the institutional need. This pattern, the same symbol deployed toward opposite ends by people who all claimed it authentically, would repeat throughout the subsequent history of the cross-seeing Western civilization. It has appeared above the doors of hospitals built to heal and above the doors of institutions built to harm. It has been carried by people devoting their lives to the poor and by people defending systems that created more poverty. The symbol survived every use of it and remained available for the next. And then there is what might be the most interesting and most contemporary chapter of this history: the cross's ornament. As decoration, as ubiquitous cultural artifact in the modern Western world, the cross appears in contexts that would have been literally unimaginable to anyone who wore it in the first 3 centuries, when doing so was a quiet act of countercultural commitment that sometimes carried genuine risk. It appears as fashion jewelry with no intended religious content, worn by people who would describe themselves as having no particular beliefs about what the symbol originally pointed toward. It appears as a tattoo whose meaning may be primarily aesthetic, family tradition, or vague cultural identification. It appears as architectural decoration in buildings, with no sacred function. It is manufactured at industrial scale in materials, ranging from gold and precious stones to plastic and wood pulp, available at price points from the extravagant to the trivial. There is a question worth sitting with here. When a symbol is reproduced this many times, and appears in this many different contexts, and is claimed by people across this wide spectrum of belief and disbelief, what happens to its meaning? Can a symbol survive its own ubiquity? Can what it originally pointed toward still be accessible through an object that has been so thoroughly absorbed into the decorative vocabulary of a culture? The honest answer is, it depends on who is looking. For some people, the most ordinary reproduction of the cross remains a window into something they consider deeply real and deeply significant. For others, it has become entirely decorative, a pleasant shape with agreeable cultural associations. For others still, it carries a mixture of family memory, cultural identity, and something that might be described as hope without specific theological content. What is remarkable is that the cross, unlike almost any other symbol that has been reproduced at this scale, has not entirely lost its capacity to provoke. It still generates strong responses of nearly every variety in a way that purely ornamental symbols do not. Even people who wear it without religious intention often pause when asked directly what it means. Even people who are hostile to it describe their hostility in terms that go beyond aesthetic preference. The symbol seems to resist complete domestication, perhaps because of what it originally was. Because unlike most symbols that began as beautiful or inspiring things, the cross began as something deliberately terrible. It carries the memory of that origin, even when the specific memory has faded. There is something in the shape itself, in the vertical and horizontal lines meeting at the point of maximum weight, that continues to carry an echo of what it was designed to do. And that echo makes the subsequent claim about what it now means carry a weight that a purely invented symbol could never achieve. The claim that the worst thing that can happen is not the last thing that happens. The claim that what the most powerful systems of control in the world determine about a person's worth and a person's end is not the final determination. The claim that there is a perspective from which even the instrument designed to erase a person becomes the instrument through which that person is remembered across 2,000 years by billions of people around the world. That claim is built into the shape of the thing. You cannot entirely separate the symbol from its origin without losing what gives the symbol the particular kind of meaning it claims to carry. A symbol invented from nothing to represent hope would mean something. The cross means something different. It means that hope was not invented from nothing. It was found in the most hopeless place the ancient world knew how to create. And that is a different kind of claim about the world. Not that the world as it actually exists is secretly pleasant, but that even in the world as it actually exists, even at its most brutal and most final and most certain of outcomes, something can happen that the brutality did not predict and could not prevent. If that idea, that what looks most like an ending can be a beginning, resonates with something you have been searching for, that is exactly the territory the ebook Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence was written to explore with you. The link is in the description. And the question that remains, when everything about this history settles, the cross began as the most effective instrument the most powerful empire in the world had for saying that certain people were finished, that they had reached the absolute end, that nothing came after. And then billions of people across 2,000 years decided it meant precisely the opposite. What does it mean that the symbol of the end became the symbol of what does not end? That is a question worth sitting with, regardless of what you believe about the specific events that caused the change.